Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Caffe, Lena. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to everybody who is joining us from home. We have a really wonderful afternoon of music and storytelling with New York Times bestselling author Bruce Piasecki, and we also have Connelly Akstens with us, who will be giving some musical accompaniment. So it's going to be really great. If you're watching from home, be sure to say hi to me in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. All right, thanks everybody. Let's hand it over to Connelly.
Thank you, Carolyn. Would you welcome my friend Bruce, please?
Thank you, Connelly. So Connelly and I are here to entertain you during this time of COVID's additional surge. I honor each of you for braving the winter and COVID. We're here to talk about vignettes from my last 3 books. I've separated them into the past, so there'll be about 20 minutes on the past, the present predicaments that we experience, because I wrote a fable about COVID called 2040. And also, we're going to talk about the near future, where hopefully we'll enjoy some time. So my past is really about 4 words, and they were words that my mother, Lillian Ann Piasecki, drilled into my brain. You all probably have some thoughts about focus phrases your mother or father taught you. So I was a precocious young man from Long Island, and when I discovered that I not only had one real biological sister amidst Puerto Rican brothers and Asian American sisters, which I'll read to you about, that I had a sister who died 10 years before my birth, called Connie. So I'm looking at my little 5'2" mother. I'm pretty big for a guy compared to a 5'2" mother. And I said, Mom, why did you never tell me about Connie? And she said, thank you, dear God. That's the lesson of Connie, Bruce. You have to understand those words before you could grow up. I didn't feel angry at that point, nor did I feel enraged. She was, after all, a sister that I never felt in the flesh. But I thought about those 4 words, and I've come to the conclusion that they taught me gratitude, and then they also taught me a key feature you'll see in my work, resolve. So I got a little bolder as testosterone started surging through my system, and I confronted my mother about the death of my father, who was a military factory worker who died when I was 3. And damn it, again she said, Bruce, the answer is thank you, dear God. Now, this time those words made me incredibly enraged. The whole idea that I would be thankful of the denial of a father, of a competitive influence, really caused me to write some of these passages in my creative memoir called Missing Persons. So I want to start with a balance. In the end, maybe 70 minutes from now, I hope you feel 5 things from me. I think you think about your own past, your own present predicaments, and your own future, but you also think about communitas, community, and you also think about the magic of words. Edwin Torres and Sui Ying Chang. So, you're looking at a big, white, Caucasian old man. And so for most of my life, people didn't realize I had Puerto Rican brothers and Chinese sisters, and grew up poor because I'm no longer poor. So I think I felt the weight of prejudice when I wrote this. Edwin Torres and Sui Ying Chang were my brothers and sisters, my Adam and Eve. While he watched over his foster brothers and sisters from different races, from different regions, come and go, Edwin and Sui stayed the longest in his memories. While he had other people pressed near him now that he was a high school basketball star, it was the bounce and hope in Edwin's voice and Sui's dark, round Asian eyes that tracked his moods the most in youth. When they were sad, he was very sad. He felt that he was their protector and the only one in his neighborhood thinking about where their next dollar might come from. He felt these foster brothers and sisters depended on him. He knew this in a primal way, in a way deeper than the prejudices that surrounded him on Long Island. After his father, Walter, died, the veterans and Social Security benefits were not adequate to feed and clothe the family. He saw that early in his life. While his teachers and coaches chose to ignore such topics, he would need to earn his way out of this predicament. His mother could not afford a car. They never ate out. The only book of consequence in her house was the Bible. He started working at age 10, washing white walls on cars, working as a landscaper in Magoon Landing for Mario Puzo, laying sod like his Uncle Ziggy to build that family purse. Lillian, his mom, left factory work as he started to come in with some money and opened their home to foster children, which gave them a small but steady new income. Locked into this arrangement, he felt close to his foster brothers and sisters most of the time. He remembers that fine day when he first and finally received formal working papers at the Rotunda at Beach Street. He was now in his teens and in full bloom, and he felt at last ready to serve the family. Edwin was Puerto Rican and hyperkinetic, always rocking, always moving, always in trouble at school. Edwin is a monster, the West Islip principal told him at Westbrook, many years before he had learned to fight back with words. The expert said Edwin was hyperkinetic because his biological parents were heroin addicts. Edwin was the only brother that stayed with him for more than 6 years. Everyone else went missing. Most of the others were adopted by other families in a matter of months or a few years. He viewed this as a message, not from God. The accumulated worth of those losses defined his sense of what was missing in his life. Sui Ying Chang was born with birthmarks on her arms and legs, purplish maps that told the nuns of New York City's Catholic foundling home that she was a mix of Han Chinese and Samoan. Margaret Mead herself had once looked over her smallish body and pronounced her special and odd. There were other scars on Sui Ying's young body from her mother, who had left her on a lit stove in Spanish Harlem. But that was before she found her real mother in my mother, Lillian Ann Piasecki. So I think one of the things that I want to think about communitas, or care, or community, is that in order to get past our racial tensions in America, I think we have to realize that genetically, many of us come from interracial families. It's just not noticed, right? Many of us come from those backgrounds. Here's my reflection on my mother, and I'm sure that it has to do with those 4 words and the kind of seasonal depressions I felt before I won some scholarships to play basketball in college. One February day, about a year after his discovery of the death of his sister, and now a new graduate student, he imagined his mother aged and near death. He knew this to be perverse, but he also knew it was necessary. He was still a young man, no more than 22, and she was still an active woman in her 50s, living alone on Long Island with full control of her faculties. But during this particular visit she made to him in Ithaca, he chose her to imagine her near death. It was part of the perversity in his third-party, third-person view of the world. Everything must be seen from a distance. Nothing must be felt closely. You must admit no emotion. He must be prepared for anything. He must watch the early death of his father at 3, so why not witness the loss of his mother? It was during that visit, that stark February week in Ithaca at Cornell, when his boots were etched with ice, that she showed him how to construct a response to his feeling of captivity. His mother knew that he was getting lost in his memories, his rage of growing up on Long Island, that he was bitterly taxed by his past. With humor and some resolve, she suggested that he outsmart his current options in order to face the work world. He had to learn how to father himself sooner rather than later. "Bruce, why not come back with me to the factory life?" she asked. That broke the freeze. Nothing should be taken for granted when a mother tells a tale of a return to harsh origins like that. She was telling him to see past Cornell, see past the basketball court, past the certain professorships, into what he must become or else return forever. Before success, even before aspiration, Lillian's story showed him a sweet, ripe, pear-like middle way of retreat from reality. Before the declarations of Christ, before his conversations with Socrates, before the resolve he learned from Marcus Aurelius, she kept him clothed, she kept him young, despite the rigid demeanor and repressions inherent of graduate training. She called his life one of elaborations, one of stories he could share in stark embellishments. When home or over the phone, she told him these stories nearly every afternoon. When faced with something complex, he would still ask himself, well, what choice would Lillian make? Her tales were more basic, more fundamental than those tied themselves in the classroom, or even in every word of Christ or Socrates or Aurelius. She hadn't provided him an exact script, but she had offered him a mother's path for him to grow past the death of his father. With that said, I'd like to see if anybody had any questions or thoughts about family psychology and your past, because I'm going to then move on to being age 42 and discovering the pleasure of the birth of my daughter, which also changed my life. So anybody have any comments about having interracial brothers or sisters, or having a mother that says, "Thank you, dear God," to all the real trauma of life? Do I see Gina raising her hand?
Bruce, how did your sister die? Do you know?
Yes. She was born with gastrointestinal impediments that were genetic. And I never saw a doctor in high school. My mother couldn't afford a doctor. So I had to deduct it by conversations with people in retrospect. But she was born with what back then they just called mongoloidism, which was a syndrome. And there was some discussion that they thought that this came from the saltpeter in my father's blood and sperm, but they don't know for sure. So my Uncle Steve told me, Gina, that she should have died within the first 9 months, but my mother fed her 8 times a day, and she lived until the age of 2.5. But what I found interesting is my mother stripped all pictures of my father from the house and all pictures of Connie from the house, and all books and all newspapers. There was only the Bible. So the way my mother coped with that was this incredible focus, and she didn't feel she didn't act like the other traumatized people in my life. Any other comments? Now you can imagine all of this happens before I get to Cornell, really, and before I meet my magical wife, Andrea Masters, at Cornell. So everything changes starting at about age 18 or 19. But what I find incredible is as you become an old man, an old white man with no hair, an old white man with a company, nobody remembers really what formed you. And that, I think, is a fascinating story about the past. That the past seems important to me, to think about our past, especially at the beginning of a new year. Barbara Cass.
Have you heard stories about your father? Did your mother talk to you about your father?
My uncles and my surrogate fathers talked to me more about my father, Walter John Piasecki, than my mother. Yes, I did. He was a soldier. He had B12 deficiency. He had trouble in the Pacific, where he was in a one of those circular bombings in the Pacific raids. He was a munitions logistics guy, so he was underground for two weeks. So I heard stories like that I verified about my father. But the emotional nature of him, it was chilling for people to say to me, "You look like your father," because I had no understanding of what he looked like.
There were pictures of him.
She hid the pictures of him. She also hid most of the scholarship letters that I got. I didn't know, except in retrospect, that I received a number of scholarships. So it's not that she was controlling. It's just that she had a strange form of care. Any other questions before we go on?
Scholarships that you had to respond to in order to receive them?
I didn't receive them. There were letters that I found in a box from Dartmouth and Yale, University of Maryland. I did accept 2 summer scholarships to play basketball at University of Maryland when I was very angry at 15 and 16 years old. And I played with real pros like Earl of Pearl Monroe or Kevin Lagery, or people that would become professional, like the other guy from Long Island that got the scholarship. And I got some, that was delivered to me, Frank, by my high school coach, because I played varsity since 9th grade. So he didn't tell my mother about it. He just gave me the scholarship. But the ones from Dartmouth and Yale, I think it helped me realize in retrospect that it wasn't only Cornell that wanted me to play. But they were in a box. When she died, I found them in a box. Yes?
So how did Cornell slip through? How did you get that one?
I think it was because I was dating a girl from Cornell at the time that my mother liked. I mean, that's how random it is. Yeah, she went to Cornell with me as a freshman. That's how random it is, Gina. I mean, when you think about fate, right, and you think about family dynamics, the metaphor that I used to use when I was a teacher at RPI was that I felt like I was a jack in the box, and my coaches would wind it up, and I'd go like this hyperkinetically, like, and then I'd go boom, and I'd push it up, and I'd jump out, and I'd perform again Friday night, and then they put me back in the box, and I would get ready to perform again. You know what I mean? That's what I felt like from 15 to about 20. I didn't know who was watching, but I was definitely performing. So here's, I think we're ready to talk about my sense of self, which is I've always felt myself a dog. If I had a spirit or a destiny, it was to be a dog. The art of being a dog. He had once known a dog named Zachary. Zach would limp for affection and attention. He was always sniffing the ground, but he was always eyeing something better. Zach was a fantastic dog, warm and fuzzy, smart and tenacious. Nonetheless, he was easily distracted by a new smell or a new thought. Even squirrels would change him instantly and change his calculating equations. And he'd sprint off, forgetting the limp that got him human attention in the first place. In youth, and even in middle age, there were so many ways he felt like Zach, felt exactly like a dog. For years, he thought this was because he had come into the world poor, with little advantage except his senses and wit, but now he knew better. Colette, his daughter, thought the dad man had been a bear in another life. Because you protect your cubs and because you are big and cuddly, she said. Not really, he thought. The deeper, less romantic reality was that he was a dog. No adults really felt him to be a bear, and while he loved his young Artemis daughter, he felt that she exaggerated both his size and his reach. His animal spirit was reflective of this deep nature. What was funny was that they, the public, kept feeding him to perform, prompting him to perform. Opponents in the basketball court, whenever he caught them in a fake, called him a dog. Early business partners like Robin, who had owned paintings by Rembrandt, paused when he bought them out to call him a dog. When he met his investors' obligations and left the world of debt before age 40, some had called him un-American, but most had called him behind his back another white, Cornell-bred dog. They were better breeds, usually from schools like Harvard or Instead or INSEAD or the London School of Economics or the Manchester School of Business. And their deans and faculties had come from superior pedigrees. He took no offense, but as he did on the basketball court, he chose to make their offense the object of his skill. Bruce felt that the metaphor of being a dog was much more convincing. He was afraid to tell his minister this. He knew to go with what interested him until something even better roamed before him. Having survived a rather turbulent youth, he thought, you can always go back to the original smells and find a place to leave your mark. That's about the past. Now, I will, after Connelly gets us into the present, I want to start with the birth of my daughter in the present. I want to shout out to some of the people who are live streaming that told me. One is a Karen Coyne from Nantucket, who is a board of directors person I've gotten to meet. I want to say hello to my daughter, Colette, at Upstate Medical in Syracuse, and her husband, Sam Ganji. And if I'm lucky, my biological sister is watching from Florida. So this fable, which I'm happy to see that some of you came to learn about and maybe read, I wrote during the first year of COVID. The newest book I wrote during the second year of COVID. And I want to give you a sense of my present predicaments and then just flip back to how the birth of my daughter helped liberate me from even these present predicaments and from the past traumas. But first, let me set the stage of this fable. There are 5 characters in this fable. One is a person called George, who is the protagonist and probably mostly me. There is a Valissima, who is his wife. And then there is a guy called Abe and a guy called Winston. Abe is a journalist who lives in the present, and Winston is an attorney. Yes, Abe is partially modeled off of my supercharged superhero, Abe Lincoln. So I've taken my college roommate and made him a hyper super guy, journalist. And I also made Winston after Winston Churchill, one of my favorite writers. And Winston, in reality, is another Cornell friend of mine for life who is a tax attorney and an appellate trial attorney. The 5th and best character in the book is a guy called Uncle Finn. And before I get serious on COVID, I wanted to tell you that before COVID struck, there was this episode where a contractor was working up at the apex, high on a ladder of one of our home, which is from 1760, so it needs a lot of contractors. And he was a very athletic stud type of guy. And there was in my firm at the time a very beautiful woman, a Native American woman, who, it was summertime, so she was not overdressed. And as she walked up my driveway, this guy literally jumped down to meet her. It was so funny to me that he was willing to risk his life just to talk to this woman that he never saw before, but he knew she was the one. She was already married to a Navy SEAL sniper. That much I knew, right? But he didn't know it there at the top of the ladder. So anyway, I invented that scene into Uncle Finn, right? So I present the person working on my house, and this kooky super character in this fable comes down the driveway and asks questions of the contractor, like, "Can I have a cigarette?" The guy's already at the top of the thing. So throughout this fable, Uncle Finn is the eccentric guy with a perfect memory who never went to high school. He finished barely high school, but he has a perfect memory. So you could talk to him about anything if he happened to flip through the book in Saratoga Library, because he has a total visual memory, but he doesn't necessarily understand what he saw. He's just can recite what's going on in Chaco Canyon or what's going on in Saratoga in 1760. So I made up these 5 characters mostly because of COVID. Chapter 1, Divine Splendid Isolation. George was a reflective man, a thinking man. George understood that winter is survived by the vain, the honest, the militant, the self-deceiving, the naive, the fragile, and the sincere. God is good to a range of peoples. For George, life was all magical, a magical battle between thought and event, between truth and big lies. Yet winter remains hard on all types of humans, he observed, as evident each year in the neighborhood. Their survival was much about luck and persistence as it was about likely selection or preservation of the saints. You may have strong first principles on how you run your family and yourself, enjoy your friends. You may even believe in what matters. Yet winter in Saratoga will test those principles like a virus. He adopted in winter his mother's habit of cracking sunflower seeds to appease some of the anxiety he found each day in his face and his jaw. Because George was raised poor, there was a quiet desperation in him. His Puerto Rican foster brothers taught him the better word, desperado. It rhymed with tornado, and he felt it a more incisive word. To George, desperation sounded too Ivy League, too much like those nose in the air folks. Desperado. Now that was a word George could stand behind. No matter how rich he became, no matter how secure, how much he was loved, he wrote about and he woke each day with the fears of Job. Certain some new acquaintance was close to the devil. This unsteadiness came with his sense of the virtues and the vices. His wife of Sicilian descent could imagine a crown of thorns above his spine, and she would massage at night his weary neck, saying, "It must be hard, George, keeping up such a big head all day." They would laugh together, ready to cuddle. "You know, you have a stupid mouth sometimes," Felicima warned him. He would think about that for about a decade and then write another book about it. She encouraged him to do more and say less. Even though he tried to remain stoic and silent and listen to others and listen to what they really had to say, he had an irrepressible native exuberance in his bones. He was a reflective man and less a stoic man. Polish peasant-made people are sometimes like this, feeling like he had ascended into a world far higher than he could ever have imagined. It was hard for George to assume the mask of silence for very long. By afternoon, after writing at his desk, he was the big mouth again. Big shot, big shit, his mother had told him 1,000 times. I guess it's kind of interesting that she spoke in 4-word imperatives, right? Thank you, dear God. Big shot, big shit. She had such a rap. My wife got to enjoy her for a couple of years, and so did my daughter. So here's the passage on my daughter. She really taught me how to be the bullshit artist that I've become, which is a necessary characteristic to run a management consulting firm, I think. So the discovery of Colette, Glens Falls Hospital, August 29, 1996. On the night Colette was born, she looked straight at her father the very first second of his life. He was, of course, talking. She felt at home with his voice. This gave him immense pleasure. Infants need words, just as they need warmth, breast milk, and soft but firm swaddling. He could sense that early on. She needed his words. Yet their need for words is immediate, not deliberate. Just words. Adults need words that can last, like a promise. Children can contemplate a vast immediate. Colette gave him a new reason to contemplate midlife. She was at once glorious, like fuzzy fiddleheads in April, about to burst forth. She walked the weekend before her first year as if the calendar had been calibrated just for her. When he looked into her patient eyes, he felt that timing was everything. At 42, he was indeed prepared to enjoy a child rearing. The ancient Anasazi knew exactly when to plant corn in Chaco Canyon to collect the right amount of sun and rain in the harsh desert light. The birth of Colette was similar harvest for him and his wife. Colette was completely herself and remained that way to his utter astonishment and stunning satisfaction forever. A couple of reflections on the present. I think I tried to say on the past that trauma is not just something you experience in the present. Trauma is structured by the past, and that part of becoming a fuller human is to outsmart trauma, even when the trauma is an imagined one of the death of your sister 10 years before you were born. But I think regarding the present is about predicaments, right? So one of my wife's favorite things in describing me is I'm always worried about the next time I'm going to eat. It's like the whole subject of eating is like a real world predicament for me. I mean, is it going to happen at 7 o'clock in the morning or at noon? Or will it be by 6 o'clock? In my understanding of the present is that it's full of predicaments. So that even if you've trained yourself to have some gratitude, you're still experiencing the present as a predicament, as something both sweet and sour. And I think that is why my Fable is a celebration, as Bobby Carlton has said in his endorsement of it, of the protest songs of Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen and Leonard Cohen, in the sense that they are masters of the bittersweet, and they understand the sweet retrospection of days gone by. And I think that my Fable is about present predicaments and how family and friends help you survive COVID-19. I think we're all beginning to sense, as you all are survivors so far of this thing that's devastated our world, and especially our American divisions, that we're survivors. And so part of what I want to read to you are a few passages about survival. But before I get to that, I want to return to this notion of how'd I survive this COVID-19 present predicament. And so I'd like to tell you that Uncle Finn represents kind of creativity himself. He represents the spirit of Bob Dylan and the spirit of Fellini. These people are not rationalists. They're creative people. And Uncle Finn, throughout the story, pops in whenever people are taking themselves too seriously regarding COVID. And so he provides some comic relief throughout this story. And I guess I want to read a little bit about that so you could see about Uncle Finn's role before, in the story, George has a heart attack. And what's really fun is the people who know me, who've read this book, know that I have so many of the similar characteristics that George does as his character that several friends have told me, I didn't know you survived a heart attack. So we'll get to that in a little bit. And that's the power of words, right? The magical power of words, the magical clan of troubadours who are going into different people's spaces with embellished stories. If creativity is like a Zuni snake that wriggles through the lives of us and is blessed with lightning, then Uncle Finn was that Zuni snake. He had no formal education. He was simply brilliant. I reminded Winston that the entire life quest of William James and of our college day heroes was proof that the elites knew less than Uncle Finn. The most creative seemed to come out of modest families and out of nowhere. The elite schools never wanted to acknowledge that. It was, in a sense, a fundamental black eye in their claims to fame. This reminded me that the most learning I got from Cornell years was watching Fellini films. Uncle Finn, in his prime, was Fellini-like, pure and full of play. They were both master stories, Fellini and Finn, ringmasters of human dreams, caricaturists, puppeteers. The main and important difference is in the Fellini managed to live his life without the constraints of the state, despite the ascent of fascism in his youth. The most creative remained creative, despite the repressions of the state, the dream books, their degrees, and their immediate families. Uncle Finn, too, shows me this is possible in the remaining glimmers of my life. Birds of the business world eventually have to leave the nest and fledge into creativity. If they are lucky, they will not smash as they approach gravity. So before we finish the present, let me read you about parts from the heart attack. And what was so fun about writing about the heart attack is I was reading a lot of the lyrics of Dylan that when you really watch them, they make remarkable sense while at the same time making no sense, right? So I was trying to write in prose 15 pages that made remarkable sense, but at the same time no sense. Because after all, the character's having a heart attack, right? So how can he be making sense? So I wrote 15 pages about this heart attack. And here are some of the passages. Standing before Tony at last, I had a heart attack. I had a heart attack. Big deal. Tens of thousands have them. While there have been many advances in prevention and treatment over the years, by 2040, heart attacks are as common as cancer and dementia. This I found both hilarious and liberating. No point crying over spilt milk, my mother said, but she still said, take out the mop. Now I knew what she meant. You have to move on. Get past the initial stages of this damn heart attack. You can hear this in the most momentous movements of Brahms and Mozart. Move on is the key in each chamber of your heart. Tony's heart attack was 10 months before mine. He had left our neighborhood to recover secretly from that heart attack that humbled him, which worsened on his motorcycle in his new town in Maine. It was a miserable recovery for him, like salt in the wounds of his militant pride. Oh, by the way, Tony is a minor character, but he's a neighbor who's a conspiratorialist. And he is convinced that Caterus Creek was first occupied by George Washington and that the Federalists must reassemble to keep Saratoga free. And this was an actual neighbor of mine that I put into the book. So Tony is there when I'm having my heart attack. My thoughts and my patterns of my thoughts included word patterns. The image of that rope with the large mast descending, images of Colette's lovely face with her gift box and her camera, her athletic form serving a volleyball when only 10, the slender grace of Arlissima through the decades. My home, its colors, its rooms, the stone church, the latest breakthrough at the Cleveland Clinic found in 2040 regarding one's heart. It all streamed through blood in my thoughts. My body was concentrating the resources of my brain to serve the needs of my overactive heart. Amazing, Tony said, as if he was hearing my thoughts. He's not even dead yet, Allison. Verlissima arrived. She was always so strong. She lay down next to him, face to face, her lovely Sicilian eyebrows and a massive, sympathetic knit. I began instantly to feel better. Tony asked, how the hell did that big boy do that? I had no clue, really. I simply survived. Abe, if he were there, would have said it was a recovery based on the goodwill of all my friends and all the good books I had shoved into my brain. The event police had not seen such a recovery in years. One of the three cops said out loud, I am beginning to learn to mind my own business. To my surprise, it turns out heart failure patients who are heavier and have slightly higher blood pressure actually do better than thinner peers like Tony. You need a little fat, a little buffer to survive these late-day seizures. It is true, after all, I have proven more tenacious than my hunger itself. You need to be like me to weather such a storm. Tony had always been tall and thin and anxious, like so many of his peers in the elite teams. He was buff, thin as a rail. He looked like a CEO, but he was also always anxious, never calm, never satisfied. In studying many bankers and CEOs, I had seen them many times in the elite class. They looked emaciated. In a Polish essentialism, we take some extra tummy to be healthy. It was always rounder, despite the daily exercise. I was always laid back. I could fall into a nap any time of day, not because I was tired, but just because I knew how to relax. Bankers went for cocaine. I rented a couch. I began to laugh inside. Felissima actually sensed I was laughing inside. She put her warm hand on my forehead and smiled. I began to smile openly on the ground. There was some kind of divine justice in all this after all, that even my superhero George Orwell had not conceived or figured out. I felt like I was in a Fellini movie, one of the nicer, kinder, shorter ones. I had become all eyes and ears and feeling, and comma, too. This is the commercial part of the session. There are 5 of Connelly's CDs in the back for you to pick up. I think he's selling them, I don't know at what price, $10, $15?
125, 135.
I talked too much about bankers so far.
The more applause, the price goes up. So don't applaud, whatever you do, and they'll keep down to probably $10 a piece.
$10 each. And then Connelly's book is there for $25.
That's right.
And my 2 books are there $20 each. That's because they average $20. They have separate list prices on Amazon.
So you can go home broke.
Yeah. And then I didn't bring the memoir because I didn't want to sell the memoir. I wanted to sell the 2 recent ones. So the commercial is now over. And I remember talking to my publisher who contracted me to write my memoir after a New York Times bestseller. And I told him I wouldn't write a memoir unless I could write about my own death. I don't know if you've seen that film called Get Low, where this Southern gentleman does a deal with the funeral service because he wants to watch his own death before he dies, right? So he pretends he's dead. So I wrote a memoir where I wrote it at age 60, but I wrote about the exaggerated, extended demise of that same person. So I'm going to read to you the 2 final sections of the memoir before I get to the new book about the near future. And so you can't write a memoir in the American tradition So my friend Jay Perini edited the Norton Anthology of American Autobiography, going from Quakers and Ben Franklin's excerpts to great modern writers, far greater writers than myself. But Jay was kind enough to write the intro to my memoir, so that's the best part. But I think the second best part is my imagined death, because I think it's funny. Around here, everyone talks like lions. Many of the people he came to love had rare skills to know when to stay and precisely when to go. He always had the ability to love, even after they had left him. In the memories of his old, dying age, he never slept alone. Everyone came to speak like lions so that he could hear them. They spoke with pride, too, as indirection and nuance were weak second cousins to getting through to his thick brain in the first place. He could hardly hear. His superhero, Walt, had said, all goes onwards and upwards. Nothing collapses. And to die is different than what anyone supposed, and luckier. Whenever he thought that line, an entire zoo of memories filled his mind, and it was with pride that he looked across the zoo of all his friends and all his family members, and he could call that pride his own. He remembered the many times when enemies were near, and sometimes, they were kept from his door. And for this, he felt deep gratitude. It was now time for him to surrender graciously. Everyone mattered in his pride. Everyone knew it was time. No one told everyone. Everyone just knew it right. He honestly took up his voice and threw it to the wind. That was fun to write that, about my own imagined death. This book is written for the future generations. I wrote it over the last year, and it's called A New Way to Wealth, The Power of Doing More with Less. And that's because I think one of the things I learned in listening to my mother and working through a whole series of 40 years of business predicaments was that the real strength in life is learning how to say no to stupid ideas, or how to say no to bad things you want to do, or how to say no to wasteful gestures and thoughts, right? So this book celebrates 4 human instincts that make community. The first is competitive frugality, like Ben Franklin all over again. How do you do more with less? If you have less resources than your competitor, how do you outperform them, right? So there's a lot about that. And mostly it's about avoiding knuckleheads. The best way to do more with less is just don't get involved with knuckleheads who want to give you too much debt or want to give you false promise. Just do more with less. So that's the first third of the book. It's written as a global book for children of the next generation. The second thing that it talks about is loyalty, an un-American word right now, really. We're supposed to take sides on everything. But loyalty, when you really examine the word, is about a loyalty to humanity. So I try and write about that. It's also about innovation and how creativity is born from scarcity instead of surplus. So I've already gotten into a little bit of an internet fight on this because I would say things like I got inspired by listening to George, listening to Bob Dylan or listening to Bruce Springsteen. And somebody wrote recently on the internet that I've been on Springsteen's yacht and there's nothing frugal about it. But if you listen to a Springsteen song, right, there's 1,000 things that are frugal about it, right? If you listen to his song Philadelphia, where he brings the white man into awareness of urban HIV, right? What an amazing song. He says in about 238 frugal words what I didn't know about all those people dying of HIV. So he could have a yacht, as far as I'm concerned. I don't need a yacht, but he can have one. right? He's frugal with his words. So what I wanted to do in this case was think about the near future and think about the fact that in a time of climate change and capital constraints, frugality will become more important as each of the 8th and 9th billion person is born on Earth, right? So if you look at Africa, if you look at other places, I did work, I'm not proud to say, for 5 years in a team of 7 for Walmart in Africa, where we were trying to figure out, they spent $2.1 billion buying a supermarket chain called Massmart. And so we did the economic intelligence of teaming Walmart with partners like the Chinese Syngenta and Bank of South Africa, because there's so much corruption in Africa that the IMF and the World Bank can't solve it. It has to be solved by a coordinated effort. And so our project was really about poverty alleviation, and I was working for the devil, Walmart, right? $600 billion devil. When I say that I wake up in the morning thinking I'm going to be in bed with the devil, that has been my life. And what I wanted to do in working on Africa is tell you all that there are 22 nations in Africa that will be prosperous when you die. They are the fertile crescent of the future. And that even though we don't think about Africa, most of Europe and most of the world will be fed by Africa. So I made that discovery through seven person team, studying the actual economics of places like Mozambique and South Africa. And then I came to the next conclusion in writing this book, in that when these kids that I'm concerned about in this book, not my daughter, because she'll do well in America, but the kids around the rest of the world that I want this book to reach, they will have to suffer different kinds of constraints. They will have to suffer a different rate of consumption that our generation got to enjoy, or Colette's generation gets to enjoy. And in addition, 4 out of 5 of the people of the future will be within 60 miles of a megacity. So this book has a whole chapter based on the trend of urbanization. And so part of what I wanted to write about is that that's actually surprisingly good. So I wanted to try and explain that to you all. Now, we can live in Saratoga and be part of the lucky few, but what I wanted this book to be about was about doing more with less for most of the world. Surprise, surprise, solutions in competitive frugality. The great and lasting megacities I've had the chance to work in, like Athens, Paris, New York, London, Sydney, Calgary, have evolved through the relentless competition for higher and higher efficiencies. Higher and higher efficiencies of labor, resources, capital, that is embodied in this new monster called global capitalism. These cities are open to change, to diversity, to inputs from afar. They compete on the edge with the demand for quality, price, style, and social response unite. For example, they each aspire to host the Olympics. They each aspire to host festivals, both musical and athletic. One can find them on the map of the great rock and roll tours, of the tours that find us with Dylan and others. And most significantly, they are all teeming with this logic of advanced capitalism. From the multi-speed world of Asia to the mature economies of Europe and North Africa, surprise, surprise, the competitive and the frugal thrive in these cities. Of course, no city is perfect. Racist, exclusionist, and stupid people do resist these changes. It was not so long ago that the suburbs of Paris erupted in riots right before my eyes. London is choking with automobiles. Athens alone holds half the population of the Greeks that I've worked for. But in general, so I found it really my 12th visit to Athens, where I was trying to bring on a business partner after a while, and a strategic partner that I'd been on a board for. I realized I had never been to any of the 6,000 Greek islands, that capitalism was so centered in the megacities that all of my hosts had always brought me to Athens. So that got me thinking, will that be the future, where 80% of the people will have work in megacities? I don't know. But in general, the great cities have embraced globalization in a more intelligent way than the rest. They are going global and going green at the same time. Witness the experience at FedEx, Microsoft, IBM, Train, BP, and Unilever. They each confirm this for me. This collective intelligence about fair competition seems to be based upon the history of populations rather than any religious or cultural belief. It is neither American nor European nor Asian. It is a collective global intelligence based on physical facts, if you will. In those megacities that are suffering, it strikes me now that this group intelligence about the need to do more with less is being defeated by ideologies. There is a good deal of stupidity to erase, along with a fair amount of self-delusion and denial of the realities before us. Studying reform in the megacities can help us erase social stupidity. Competitive frugality threatens to change those repressive regimes. Over time, I predict historians will call the eventual changes the beginning of the rules of a golden age. If capitalism continues to uproot repressive regimes, or noted in the last 4 decades, fascist regimes, many believe a more compassionate world might re-evolve. Of course, it is naive to suggest that this will be a linear and simple path. Battles will be fought viciously, yet those left standing will have the principles of this book in their behavior and in their families. Of course, a controversial claim that I was hoping to pause before I read the final section. So hopefully some of you have some questions about present predicaments or this passage I just read to you about megacities. Anybody want to talk about that? Hey, Bobby, do you know if anybody's streaming any questions from? Yeah. Who would be tracking that? Yeah, are there anybody, Carolyn, tracking any questions from afar? Yeah. So any questions about competitive frugality? Not questions, comments about, like, for example, just to be provocative, I've read the 3 20th century biographies of Franklin, great books like Isaac, I'm trying to remember his last name. He's written about Einstein, Abe Lincoln, and now Ben Franklin. Walter Isaacson. Great books. He doesn't mention the very essence of Ben Franklin, which is frugality, right? Ben Franklin's didn't only say a penny saved is a penny earned. Every 3rd page of Ben Franklin's autobiography is a story about frugality. And modern people have forgotten that, right? So I wrote this book as a homage to Ben Franklin to go back to what's perennial, because as the new billions come onto this earth, they have to be more like Ben Franklin, diplomatic instead of warlike, frugal, loyal, friendly, right? Because otherwise we're just wasting a few remaining resources over the next 200 years. So Frank Weaver, you've known me for a long time. You must have some thoughts on your mind.
I do. What I noticed is, you talk about Ben Franklin a lot. I don't think I've ever seen you mention his alias of Poor Richard.
Oh, yes, I haven't.
It's like he wore that as a badge. It's good to be poor.
Well said, Frank.
You don't need all this stuff.
Well, in fact, Frank, this book, A New Way to Wealth, is a deliberate echo of Ben Franklin's favorite essay, where he quotes himself as Poor Richard, called A Way to Wealth. If you haven't read Ben Franklin's 25 pages called A Way to Wealth, and then I'll get it back to Frank, it's hilarious. It's tone I tried to write this book in. So Ben Franklin is in Philadelphia. He's going to a Christmas bazaar. Everybody's hawking him to buy something. And he realizes his winter coat is kind of threadbare and he's a little cold. but he leaves the market with the celebration that he didn't buy a new coat, and that's the way to wealth. So, Frank, what were you going to ask about Poor Richard? Because Poor Richard is full of those statements.
It was more of an observation
Yeah.
that poor Richard's Almanac.
You know, but what's interesting, too, is about the passage of time. Just like Dante is turning 700 from his Purgatorio and his Divine Comedy, Franklin, is turning roughly 300 plus. And so as I travel the world, I will occasionally ask people if they know Poor Richard or if they know Ben Franklin. And the long and the short of it is, Ben Franklin was Michael Jordan before international satellites. There are more people around the world that know the name Ben Franklin than most any other American. So I'm driving a very tense trip with my Greek translator from Athens to Istanbul. And this guy, Dimitri Chris, has set me up to give these talks with all these Greek businessmen. And then we get stopped at the border by 3 young boys in Turkey with machine guns. And they keep us held there for 3 hours because Dimitri happens to be dating as a Greek a Turkish girl who's a TV star, right? He didn't tell me this, right? And in addition, Dimitri's brother, who's in the back seat with me, sells backpacks in Syria. So in the beginning, I thought they were going to kill the American. But in the end, what they really wanted was the guy who does business in Syria, because they were a little tense about that. So I told my wife, Andrea, I'll never go back to Istanbul. But as we finally get in the clearance to continue on the way to Istanbul, the first taxi drive I get from my fancy hotel in Istanbul to where I'm working, I asked the driver, have you ever heard of Ben Franklin? And this is he's kind of like, Hollywood would love this guy. He kind of has like really dark, masculine, Turkish, like he was in the military. And he says in broken English, Ben Franklin, he's our man. If he can't do it, nobody can. So I think Ben Franklin is well known, not just for inventing the eyeglasses, the bifocals and the, playing with lightning. And the passages is where he's discovering lightning. He's swimming naked in the stream and he's holding a kite, right? When you really get to know Ben Franklin, he's incredibly funny.
My other observation is everyone talks about this country's founding fathers. There were no founding fathers. There was one founding father.
He's about 20 years older than the rest, yeah.
Was a child.
Yes, they were. Revolutionary children who would put down the shades when they met because they were certain they might be targets. Yeah, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton. Ben's a generation older than them. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Ben Franklin took a horse ride up to Albany in 1759. My home is from 1760, where Andrew and I live. So I can relate to 1759. So Franklin comes up to Albany and files a speech, which we can watch in the Albany archives, called Principles of Federalism. He's thinking about the revolution in 1759. It's just that everybody, just like people like Bill McKibben have thought about climate change for 30 years, and now all of us are now thinking about it, right? So Franklin, I'm with you, Frank. Franklin is the spiritual impulse behind this book. If Dylan is the spiritual influence behind the Fable, Franklin's that for this book. I used to teach Franklin's autobiography we're down to the final 5 minutes. I used to teach Ben Franklin's autobiography for 10 years to engineers at Clarkson University, and I could watch how it changed their lives. They went from being technically gifted to purposeful just by reading about Ben Franklin, which was really interesting to see. Any questions, and then we'll end with some music. I really appreciate your attention and your time. Mr. Grandel, am I allowed to point you out? Yeah, Paul writes the beautiful pieces in the Times Union that are Paul Grandel, very heartfelt pieces about humans. He's been doing it for 20 or 30 years. I'm honored that you've come up from Albany. Paul is also the executive director of the New York State Writers Institute, which I'm very pleased to go to those great. If you don't go yet to the things he does, I hope you sign up. New York State Writers Institute. He'll alert you to what they do. Thank you for being here, everybody. It's all yours, Connie. Thank you, Connelly. So Connelly came all the way from Rhode Island for us. He lives in Rhode Island, and she's written a beautiful book called Beyond Shame that is right back there. Now, I can't tell behind the mask, are you Bob's son? Well, thank you for coming. Yeah. So we're going to hang out in the back for a little bit by the books if you wish. I've signed some of them, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for your time.
And thank you to Caffe Lena. I've been playing here since 1976, off and on, and I did a reading a couple of months ago here. And if you're just here to